Land was hard to leave, not because it was beautiful, not because it was safe, but because it was known. The smell of soil after rain, the solid ground underfoot, the sound of leaves moving in a breeze, these were things that faded the moment the sea claimed you. For those who chose the life of a pirate, land became nothing more than a distant rumor, a faint line on the horizon that might never be reached again. The moment the mooring lines were cut, the earth ceased to belong to you. You were sworn to the waves. Men did not always choose this willingly. Some were fugitives fleeing justice. Others were conscripts taken from ports and taverns, dragged aboard under threat of a blade. A few came for the promise of gold, but most came because the sea offered something no court, no city, no king could grant: escape. The ocean did not ask where you had been. It asked only whether you could survive. The ship that would carry them into exile was more than wood and rope. She was a living thing. The timbers creaked in the morning heat, sails furled tight against the first breath of wind. Her hull was stained with pitch, her deck worn smooth by years of footsteps. She had weathered storms, outpaced pursuers, and buried her dead in the deep. She bore scars, splintered railings, patched planks, but she floated still, eager to claim new waters. In the last hours before departure, the crew worked in silence, each man consumed by his own thoughts. Barrels of water, salted pork, and hardtack were hauled aboard. Powder and shot were stowed in the magazine. Coils of rope hung neatly from the pins, ready for the pull of the wind. The navigator checked his instruments, a compass with a cracked brass casing, an astrolabe polished to a dull shine, and a collection of charts so worn that some coastlines had faded into invisibility. These tools were his lifeline, though he knew well that the CCT cared nothing for ink or brass. The tide turned and the order was given. Sails unfurled with a great snapping sound, catching the wind like the breath of a giant. The deck tilted as the ship leaned into the pull of the current, slipping free from the dock. Those on land watched her go, their faces unreadable. In moments, the shoreline began to shrink, houses dissolving into shadows, the harbor wall melting into the horizon. The first day at sea was always deceptively gentle. The crew adjusted to the rhythm of the deck beneath their feet. The gulls followed for a time, their cries mingling with the groan of timber. Men spoke little. They were still thinking of the land behind them. But by nightfall, with the coast lost in darkness, the ocean began to whisper its truth. The air grew colder, the stars sharper, the water black and infinite. For the unseasoned sailor, this was when unease set in. The ocean had no end, no border, no wall to lean against. It surrounded you completely, a moving desert of salt and shadow. The ship was a speck adrift in something vast beyond comprehension. The old hands knew the feeling well. They had learned to stop thinking about what lay beneath. Miles of water, deeper than a man could dream, colder than death itself. The captain kept to himself, appearing only to give orders or consult with the navigator. His face was carved by wind and sun, his eyes unreadable. He trusted his ship, trusted the wind, but trusted no man completely. He had seen too many betrayals, too many mutinies born from hunger, fear, or greed. Out here, loyalty was measured in action, not words. Days turned to weeks. The crew settled into their duties, trimming sails, scrubbing decks, repairing lines frayed by the wind. The cook ladled out thin stew from a pot that never seemed to empty, though its contents grew stranger as the voyage wore on. Fresh water was rationed, and every man guarded his tin cup like a treasure. It was during these long stretches that the ocean began its slow work on the mind. The sameness of each day, the endless expanse of water, the horizon that never grew closer, it eroded thought, wore down memory. Men began to forget the details of their old lives. Faces blurred, voices faded. The only reality was the creak of the ship and the pull of the wind. Still, there were moments when the sea seemed almost kind. A sunrise that turned the waves to molten gold, a pod of dolphins racing the bow, the sudden warmth of a southerly breeze after weeks of chill. These were gifts the ocean offered sparingly, reminders that beauty and danger often came from the same hand. By the end of the first month, the men no longer spoke of land. It was not gone. It simply no longer mattered. The sea was their world now, and it would test them in ways they could not yet imagine. The storms were coming, and with them, the true measure of who would endure and who would be claimed by the deep. The navigator was not a man of chatter. His work required silence, a mind uncluttered by gossip or fear. Every morning before the sun broke the horizon, he climbed to the quarterdeck, compass in hand, and took the measure of the world. He read the wind in the set of the sails, the currents in the color of the water, and the coming day in the restless mood of the sky. Maps were his constant companions, though none of them told the whole truth. The oldest charts were crowded with warnings, inked illustrations of monstrous fish, curling tentacles, and phrases like, "Here be dragons." Those were relics of a time when men believed the sea was alive with beasts large enough to swallow a ship whole. Even now, with Basiti, each more of the world mapped and measured, there were stretches of ocean no man had ever crossed. He worked by three guides: the compass, the stars, and the sun. The compass was his constant, an unblinking eye that pointed ever north, its needle trembling but sure. At night, when clouds spared the sky, he searched for Polaris, the North Star, steadfast above the shifting heavens. With its help, he could trace their path even when the wind carried them far from the intended course. By day, he read the sun's arc and measured the shadows cast on deck, making his calculations with the precision of a man who knew lives depended on his accuracy. But the sea was a sly adversary. Currents pulled them off course without warning, bending their path miles from where the navigator's figures suggested they should be. A headwind could hold them in place for days, the ship creeping forward inch by inch as if pushing against an invisible wall. In those moments, the crew grew restless. Men grumbled that they were lost, that the compass had turned traitor, that the navigator had misread the heavens. The captain listened to none of it. He had seen too many voyages destroyed by doubt, and he trusted the man with the charts. Below deck, the navigator kept a small chest containing his most precious possessions. Inside were rolled charts, a brass sextant, and a worn logbook in which he recorded each day's progress. The pages smelled of salt and oil, the ink smudged by damp air. Each entry was brief: coordinates, wind speed, notable sightings, but together they told the story of the voyage in the language of the sea. Navigation was not just science, it was an art. The best navigators could sense their position without looking at a chart, reading the feel of the swells, the scent of the air, the flight patterns of seabirds. They knew that a sudden change in the water's hue meant land was near, that the smell of damp earth carried farther than the eye could see. In fog thick enough to blind a man at arm's length, they could still steer true, guided by the memory of currents and the sound of waves striking unseen shores. Life on deck followed the navigator's rhythm. The crew worked in watches, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, so the ship never slept. The helmsman kept his eyes on the horizon, adjusting the wheel with small, precise movements. The sails were trimmed and retied according to the wind's mood. Rope was coiled, barrels checked, and the bilge pumped to keep the ship from growing heavy with water. Even in calm weather, the work was constant. Food was a daily reminder of distance. Fresh provisions spoiled quickly, leaving the crew with salted pork, hardtack, and whatever fish they could catch. Hardtack was a cruel joke of a meal, flour and water baked into slabs so tough they could break a man's teeth. Weevils sometimes nested inside, but no one bothered to scrape them out. They were as much a part of the ration as the bread itself. Water, stored in casks, grew stale and brackish, taking on the taste of the wood. The men drank it anyway. Every few days, the navigator gathered the crew to share their progress. He would point to the charts, tracing the route they had taken and the one yet to come. Sometimes it was good news. A strong wind had carried them farther than expected, or a favorable current had pushed them along their course. Other times it was grim. They had been driven back, or a storm had forced them far from the trade route, adding weeks to their journey. The men listened in silence, their faces revealing nothing. Out here, time meant little. The stars became their constant companions. On clear nights, the sky spilled open above them, endless and glittering. Constellations marched across the heavens. Orion with his belt, Cassiopeia on her throne, the great swan of Cygnus stretching its wings. The navigator knew them all, could name them like old friends. The crew, less formal in their astrances, Omi told stories about the shapes, tales of gods and monsters, of hunters chasing prey across the sky for all eternity. These stories were comfort in the dark hours before dawn, when the sea was a black mirror and the ship seemed to drift between worlds. And yet, for all his skill, the navigator knew that one day the sea might outwit him. A sudden storm could tear away the sails and cripple the mast, leaving them at the mercy of wind and current. A fog could last for days, blotting out the stars and hiding the sun. A broken compass, a missing chart, a single wrong calculation. These could doom them to drift until their water ran out and the crew was too weak to stand. But he also knew this: without risk, there was no reward. The sea did not give up her treasures easily. Every gold coin in the hold, every barrel of stolen rum, every chest of jewels hidden beneath the captain's bed, these were the spoils of 1,000 navigated miles. And so he worked on, eyes sharp, mind steady, steering them ever deeper into the vast and merciless blue. The men trusted him not because they understood his craft, but because they had no choice. He was the thread that stitched their fate together. As long as the compass turned and the stars shone, they could believe they were on their way somewhere, though none of them could be certain where the journey would end. The sea was not constant in its loyalties. One day it was a faithful ally, its winds steady and its waters calm, carrying the ship forward as though eager to see her reach her destination. The next, it was a traitor, whipping the sails into chaos, turning the waves into mountains, and throwing the vessel off course as if mocking the skill of her crew. To live upon it was to accept that there was no pact between sailor and ocean, only a truce that could be broken at any moment. The first true storm came at dusk. The horizon darkened, unnaturally fast, as though some vast curtain was being drawn across the world. The sun, still hanging low, cast a blood-red light over the water, but the glow felt wrong, an omen, not a blessing. The old hands exchanged quiet looks, their jaws tightening. The younger men, still too green to know the signs, whispered and laughed, pretending they did not feel the creeping weight in the air. Then came the wind. It struck without warning, rattling the rigging and snapping the sails like the report of gunfire. Orders rang out, the sails reefed, the deck secured, loose cargo lashed down, but the storm was already upon them. Rain came in sheets, blinding the helmsman and turning the deck into a river. The ship lurched violently, her bow climbing a wave so steep it seemed impossible that she would not roll backward. Men clung to the rails, their knuckles white, their feet sliding on the slick planks. Lightning split the sky, revealing for a heartbeat the vast wall of water that bore down on them. In that moment, every man aboard felt the smallness of their world. The ship, so solid underfoot in calm weather, was now nothing more than a scrap of wood tossed between the teeth of giants. The captain's voice cut through the roar of wind, steady and sharp, driving the men to their stations. The storm did not care for courage, but without it, they would be lost. They fought through the night. Sails were torn, ropes snapped, and the mainmast groaned under the strain. Waves crashed over the bow, sweeping barrels and buckets into the sea. A man was lost overboard, swallowed by the dark before anyone could cry his name. By dawn, the storm had moved on, leaving the sea churned and restless. The crew, exhausted and hollow-eyed, worked to repair the damage. There was no mourning for the man they had lost. Grief at sea was a private thing, carried silently until it could no longer be borne. Not all enemies came from the sky. The sea was a highway, and highways had priority. Editors. Merchant ships carried goods from port to port, fat with cargo and slow under sail. Naval vessels prowled the same waters, hunting pirates with the same ferocity that pirates hunted merchants. To sight another ship on the horizon was to invite uncertainty. Was it prey, or was it death? The first sighting came on a clear morning. The lookout's cry brought the crew running to the rails, shading their eyes against the glare. The sails were foreign, broad and square, their white canvas stark against the deep blue. A merchant, by the look of her. The captain ordered a change of course, and the ship angled toward the unsuspecting vessel, her crew moving with the precision of men who had done this many times before. Approach was a delicate matter. Too fast, and the merchant might spot them and flee. Too slow, and the wind could shift, letting the prey slip away. The helmsman kept a steady hand, steering them into the blind spot of the other ship's stern. The sun was their accomplice, hiding their silhouette in its glare. By the time the merchant realized the danger, the pirates were close enough to see the faces of the men on her deck. A warning shot boomed from the cannon, its smoke curling into the wind. The merchant hesitated, then began to turn, but it was too late. Grappling hooks flew, biting into the enemy's rails. The two ships kissed with a grinding crash of wood, and the pirates swarmed aboard. Steel flashed in the sun, voices shouted in a dozen tongues, and the smell of powder filled the air. It was over quickly. The merchant's crew, untrained for battle, surrendered in a heap of dropped weapons and raised hands. The hold was opened, revealing barrels of sugar, crates of cloth, and a few chests of coin. Not the richest prize, but enough to lift the crew's spirits. The goods were transferred to the pirate ship, the merchant's sails cut to keep her drifting, and the crew left to find their own way. Mercy, if it could be called that, was given sparingly. Sometimes ships were burned to the waterline to hide the crime from any who might follow. This time the captain decided it was not worth the match. Yet every act of piracy drew attention. News traveled faster than ships, carried by whispers in taverns and reports to naval ports. The more a crew took, the greater the bounty on their heads. The ocean was vast, but it was not infinite. Eventually, every pirate met an enemy they could not outrun. Some dangers were less obvious. A ship could carry disease as easily as gold. Scurvy, born from the absence of fresh fruit and vegetables, rotted the gums and blackened the skin. Fevers spread quickly in the close quarters below deck, striking down the strong and the weak alike. The ocean had no doctors, only remedies passed down through generations, some as dangerous as the illness itself. And always, there was the greatest enemy of all, time. Even the best-built ship aged under the constant assault of salt and wind. Sails frayed, timbers warped, iron rusted. Men aged faster, their faces weathered into maps of their own. The sea did not care how skilled you were or how lucky. Sooner or later, it would take you. The ocean had a way of wearing a man down, not with sudden violence, but with a slow, steady erosion of body and mind. Storms came and went, enemies appeared and vanished, but the real battle was fought every day against the vast sameness of the sea. Out here, time was not measured by clocks, but by the rising and setting of the sun, by the swell of the waves, by the number of meals scraped from the cook's pot. At first, men counted the days since leaving port. Then they counted the weeks. Eventually, they stopped counting at all. The horizon was always the same, an unbroken line that mocked the idea of progress. It was easy to believe you were moving nowhere, trapped in a world without end. The monotony was broken only by the small rituals of ship life. Each man had a station, a duty, and a place in the unspoken hierarchy of the crew. The boatswain's whistle signaled the start of a shift, the creak of the capstan marked the raising of the anchor, the snap of canvas meant the wind had shifted and orders would follow. These sounds became the language of survival. Below deck, the air was thick and heavy, carrying the smell of tar, damp wood, and the bodies of men packed too closely together. The hammocks swayed with the motion of the ship, their ropes groaning against the beams. Sleep came in short bursts, never deep enough to erase the exhaustion. Rats skittered in the shadows, bold enough to steal food from the galley. They were tolerated only because they ate the weevils in the flour. Hunger gnawed at the crew more fiercely than any blade. The salted meat, once plentiful, grew scarce. What remained was tough and reeking of brine. Hardtack was hammered into smaller pieces before eating, not out of preference but necessity. It was easier to soften in water and choke down that way. On good days, a sailor might catch fish from the deck, lowering a line into the deep and praying for a bite. On bad days, they watched the galley serve the last of the flour mixed with water into a thin paste, a parody of bread. The mental toll was harder to see, but far more dangerous. The sea's endless motion could lull a man into a strange kind of waking dream, where days blurred together and thoughts wandered into dark waters. Tempers shortened. Petty arguments over tools or rations flared into fistfights. Old grudges festered, and suspicion bloomed in the corners of the mind. In the close confines of a ship, hatred had nowhere to go but deeper. Superstition thrived in this isolation. Men carried charms, a lock of hair from a lover, a coin with a hole drilled through it, a scrap of cloth tied around the wrist. Whistling on deck was forbidden by some, said to call up a wind too strong to control. Others refused to kill seabirds, believing them to be the souls of drowned sailors. The ocean had its own religion, made from fear and necessity, and every man practiced it in his own way. Some found ways to occupy the endless hours. Carving was common. Small figures cut from spare wood, intricate patterns etched into the handles of knives, strange runes scratched into the planks of the deck. A few men sang, their voices low and rough, weaving old shanties into the wind. These songs were less about melody than about memory, carrying fragments of home that the sea could not take. But not all distractions were harmless. Gambling thrived, dice rattling in cups and cards worn soft from use. Wagers were made over everything: how long a storm would last, whether a ship would be sighted before the next moon, which rat in the hold would outrun the others. The stakes were often small, a portion of rum, a share of tobacco, but the debts they created could turn deadly. The worst days were those when the wind died. The ship sat motionless on a sea as flat and unyielding as glass, her sails hanging limp, the heat pressing down like a weight. In those moments, the ocean became a prison. Water was rationed more strictly, tempers frayed to breaking, and men stared into the distance as if they could will the horizon closer. Sometimes the calm lasted for days, a slow torture that tested the limits of endurance. Illness was a constant threat. Scurvy loosened teeth and swelled gums until a man could barely chew. Fevers burned through the crew, leaving men delirious and raving. There was no medicine beyond what the sea might provide: salt water to clean wounds, herbs if they had been gathered in port, and the hope that the body was strong enough to fight on its own. When a man died, there was no burial but the sea. His body was sewn into canvas, weighted with iron, and slid over the side. The splash was the last sound he made in this world, yet even in the harshest stretches, there were moments of strange beauty. Nights when the sea glowed with bioluminescent light every way, traced in pale fire. Mornings when the sky blushed gold and the air smelled clean, as if the ocean itself had been washed. On those days, the toll seemed worth it. The hardships were not forgotten, but they were softened by the reminder that the sea could give as well as take. For those who endured long enough, the ocean became something more than a place. It became a way of being. The endless water stripped away the man they had been on land, replacing him with someone leaner, harder, more patient. Out here, survival was the only measure of worth, and the ones who learned to live with the toll carried it like a scar, visible only to those who had known the same life. For some, the sea never truly became home. They endured it, tolerated it, used it as a means to an end, but they never loved it. For others, the transformation was quieter, slower, like the tide wearing down stone. One day they woke and realized they no longer looked for land on the horizon. They stopped counting the days. They stopped thinking about what they had left behind. The sea had claimed them, not as a prison, but as a place of belonging. It began with the small things. The creak of the ship's timbers, once a constant reminder of fragility, became a reassuring heartbeat. The smell of salt and tar that had once been overwhelming became the scent of life itself. Even the unpredictable moods of the ocean, the way she could shift from a mirror to a maelstrom in hours, became part of the natural order, as expected as the change of seasons on land. A man who had been broken in by the sea walked differently. His stance widened, his body always adjusting to the roll of the deck, even when he stood on solid ground. His skin darkened and toughened from wind and sun, his eyes narrowed against the glare of open water. He learned to read the ocean like other men read the expressions of a friend: a ripple on the horizon, a certain color in the clouds, the smell of distant rain. These were signs that spoke in a language he had come to understand without thinking. The routines of ship life, once monotonous, now provided a strange comfort. He knew when the wind would shift just by feeling it on his cheek. He could tie a knot in darkness without hesitation. He knew the weight of the ship beneath his feet, the sound she made when she was running fast and the sound she made when she was tired. These things were as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. In this new way of living, the dangers no longer felt foreign. A storm was not an intruder, it was a neighbor, unwelcome perhaps, but familiar. The roll of thunder was no more startling than a knock on the door. Even the sight of another ship on the horizon brought not just caution but a sense of challenge, an understanding that the sea offered no prizes without risk. The bonds between the crew deepened into something that could not be easily explained to outsiders. On land, friendships formed over drink, work, or blood ties. At sea, they were forged in the knowledge that each man's life depended on the other's. You learned the sound of a man's voice in the dark, the way he cursed when the rope burned his palms, the look in his eyes when he saw the same thing you saw. A wave too high, a sail too torn, a shadow on the horizon. These were things that bound men closer than family. With belonging came a new kind of ambition. It was no longer enough to survive. Now there were routes to learn, currents to master, winds to predict with greater precision than the charts could offer. Some men began to dream not of returning to land but of finding new harbors, unknown islands, hidden passages that might shave days off a voyage or lead to ports where gold was traded for almost nothing. The sea was a map without edges, and every journey was a chance to redraw it. For the captain, this transformation was essential. A crew that thought only of returning home would falter at the first sign of Archar's ship. A crew that had come to think of the ship as their home, the ocean as their road. These men would fight harder, endure longer, and risk more. And so, whether through discipline, reward, or sheer necessity, the captain ensured that the sea claimed them fully. Even in moments of rest, the connection was there. A man could sit on the deck at dawn, watching the sun rise over a perfectly calm sea, and feel not peace, but readiness. The calm was only one face of the ocean. Behind it was the storm, the chase, the fight for survival. Home was not comfort. Home was knowing you belonged to a place that would test you again and again, and knowing you would answer. The transformation was complete when land itself began to feel strange. The first steps on solid ground after months at sea were awkward, unsteady. The air smelled different, too heavy with flowers or smoke. The silence between sounds felt wrong, lacking the constant creak and crash of the ship. Men found themselves restless, eager to return to the deck where the world was always in motion. For those who reached this point, the sea was no longer an enemy to be fought, nor a trial to be endured. It was simply life. And once it became life, it was impossible to give up. These men would die at sea, not because they had to, but because there was nowhere else they belonged. It always begins quietly. No matter how savage the ending will be, the sea hides her true intent in the calm before the storm. The air hangs heavy. The water turns a shade too dark, a blue that feels unnatural. The horizon blurs, not from distance but from a curtain of mist that seems to creep closer without wind to carry it. The old hands feel it before the young ones notice. They move differently, checking lines without being told, scanning the sky with narrowed eyes, listening for a shift in the deep heartbeat of the waves. The captain doesn't shoo, but his presence sharpens. Orders come faster but quieter, as though speaking too loudly might wake something best left sleeping. This was to be a simple voyage. The holds were full, the course familiar, the weather charts promising. But the ocean does not honor plans. She changes them, she tests them, and on this voyage, she would test them all. The first wind comes as a whisper, not a howl. It carries with it a smell, ozone, sharp as metal. The sea's surface ripples, not from breeze but from something deeper, as though the ocean floor itself is shifting. Then the wind strengthens, and the sails groan. The ship heels, wood straining against rope, and the mist ahead begins to churn into black clouds that build upon each other like towers. Rain comes sideways, driven by a wind that feels less like air and more like a hand trying to shove the ship under. The world shrinks to the length of the deck. Beyond that is only darkness and water. Lightning flashes so bright it leaves ghosts on the eyes. Brief, skeletal images of masts, rigging, and faces set in grim determination. The thunder doesn't roll. It cracks, like the world itself splitting open. Every man moves as if possessed, not by panic, but by necessity. The rigging screams as men climb to reef the sails, their bodies swinging violently against the mast. Waves slam over the rails, each one trying to tear someone away into the black. The captain's voice cuts through the chaos, not because it is loud, but because it is unshakable. He knows fear is poison here, and so he gives them none to drink. Hours stretch like days. The compass spins uselessly, the stars hidden, the charts meaningless. Navigation is reduced to survival, keeping the bow toward the swell, keeping the ship from rolling so far she cannot right herself. Every creak of the timbers, every groan of the hull is a question. How much longer can she endure? Then, in the heart of the storm, comes the moment every sailor fears, the sound that is not thunder, nor wave, nor wind. the deep, cracking snap of a mast breaking. It is a death sentence for a ship caught in a tempest, a wound from which she may not recover. The foremast goes first, splintering into the sea, dragging rigging and canvas into the black water. Men cut the lines desperately, knowing that if they fail, the weight will pull the ship down by her bow. The storm does not ease. The waves rise higher, cresting like moving cliffs, each one threatening to roll the ship onto her side. And yet, through the chaos, there are moments, fleeting but unshakable, of beauty. The phosphorescence in the wake, glowing like ghost fire. The way the lightning etches the horizon into a jagged silver line. The sheer force of the wind, so powerful it feels like it could strip the soul from the body. The crew fights until their hands are raw, their muscles screaming, their throats torn from shouting. The sea is not a place for half measures, and here, in her fury, she demands everything. When the dawn finally comes, it is not with light, but with a dim gray smear in the clouds. The storm has not ended, only loosened its grip. The ship drifts, battered but upright, her crew exhausted shadows of themselves. They have passed through the trial, but not without cost. 3 men gone to the deep, their names carried away on the wind. The voyage continues, but something is different now. The ship feels heavier, not from water in her hold, but from the weight of what has been endured. Every survivor knows they have seen the sea in her truest form. Beautiful, merciless, eternal. For some, this will be the last voyage. They will set foot on land and never again feel the salt on their skin. For others, the pull will remain, stronger than fear, stronger than loss. They will return, because once the sea has claimed you, she never truly lets you go. And for the captain, standing at the rail with eyes fixed on the horizon, the truth is simple. The sea has taken but she has given something in return, clarity. Out here there are no illusions, only the wind, the tide, and the will to endure. The voyage of the damned continues, as it always has, as it always will, until the last man who calls the sea his home is gone, and the ocean keeps her secrets forever. The storm was over, but the silence after felt almost worse. No roar of wind, no pounding of rain, only the slow slap of waves against the battered hull. The ship lay low in the water, her sails shredded to rags, her masts splintered. Salt crusted every surface, and the deck smelled of wet rope and smoke from the galley fire that had nearly gone out. Men moved like ghosts. Some bailed water from the bilge, others repaired lines with hands too numb to feel the twine. No one spoke unless they had to. The sea had taken their voices along with their shipmates, and yet, the horizon was clear. On the morning of the 4th day after the storm, the cry came down from the crow's nest. Land. A low green shape, faint in the haze, but unmistakable. The men looked at each other, half in disbelief. It was as if the sea herself had decided they had paid enough in blood and timber and was now granting them a reprieve. But the captain knew better. The sea never grants, she trades. The island was uncharted, no mark for it on their maps. It rose from the water like the back of a sleeping beast, dense forest broken by sheer cliffs, a white crescent of sand at its southern edge. The surf broke hard on the rocks, the currents unpredictable. The captain ordered the longboat lowered. A landing party rowed for the shore, their oars cutting through water so still it seemed to hide its earlier violence. When they returned, they carried coconuts, fruit, and a skin of fresh water so cold it hurt their teeth. But they also carried a warning. Strange stone markers stood just beyond the tree line, carved with symbols no man could read. Bones, too, scattered in the sand, bleached by the sun, some human, some not. The crew debated in low V-E-T-D voices, but hunger and thirst won. For 3 days they anchored in the shallow bay, mending sails, patching hullboards, and taking from the island what they needed. Each night the jungle hummed with sounds, voices perhaps, or just wind in the leaves. No one ventured far from the fire. On the 4th night, the lookout swore he saw lights moving along the cliffs. Not torches, not lanterns, lights that swayed and flickered in colors no flame should burn. The captain ordered the anchor raised before dawn. By mid-morning, the island was a shadow behind them. The sea was calm again, almost gentle, as though she were watching them go with quiet satisfaction. The men began to speak more, even laugh in small bursts, but they did not forget the storm, nor the markers in the jungle. Weeks later, when they finally made port, they told their story in pieces, sometimes omitting the worst of it, sometimes adding details for the sake of a good tavern tale. But the captain never spoke of that voyage at all. He kept the old compass from the wrecked foremast in his cabin, its needle bent by lightning, its face scarred by salt. And on some nights, when the wind shifted and the tide pulled strangely, he would stand at the harbor's edge and stare out to sea, as though waiting for an answer to a question only he had asked. The answer never came, because the sea does not explain herself. She takes, she gives, she remembers. And once you've called her home, you never truly leave. The voyage of the damned is not a single journey, it is every journey, for every soul who dares to step aboard, knowing that sooner or later the horizon will demand its price. And when it does, the only question left is how much you are willing to pay. The sea had been a graveyard for weeks now, a place where laughter sank like stones and hope was traded for the steady creak of timbers under strain. The men had stopped, decounting the days. Only the rhythm of hunger and exhaustion marked the passage of time. But on this morning, there was something different in the air. The wind was warm, not biting. The swell rolled gentle beneath the keel. And when the first light spilled across the waves, it carried with it a vision. Land. The shout from the crow's nest cracked the stillness. Men staggered to the rail, squinting into the gold haze. A green ridge rose from the horizon like the spine of some ancient beast, its flanks steep and shrouded in mist. No name for it appeared on any chart. The captain did not smile. He had seen such gifts from the sea before. Too easy, too perfect. The ocean was not generous. She was a merchant of flesh and fate, and every blessing she gave came with a debt. Still, the ship was dying. The sails were little more than frayed rags, patched so many times that the canvas was heavier than the wind could fill. The men's skin was salted leather, their eyes sunken, their lips cracked open with thirst. So the order came. Drop the longboat, take a party ashore. They found water, sweet and cold enough to sting their teeth. They found fruit, thick with sugar. They found fish that darted in clear pools and did not flee the hand. But they also found the stones. Standing in a crooked line at the jungle's edge, each marker was carved with symbols too sharp to be worn by weather, too strange to be mistaken for the work of nature. The oldest among them were dark with moss, the newest still pale and fresh cut. At the base of some lay bones, white and brittle, others still yellowed with marrow. That night they kept their fires high. The jungle whispered. Once a chorus rose from the darkness, a sound between laughter and mourning, so low it seemed to come from the ground itself. No one left the shore. By the third day the men begged to leave. The captain did not argue. They rowed back to the ship in silence, each man keeping his gaze on the waves. No one dared look back. At the island. The anchor came up at first light. The tide carried them away without fight, as if the island were letting them go, for now. But in the nights that followed, strange things began to happen. The compass spun without wind. Lantern flames guttered in air as still as glass, and sometimes, just beyond the edge of vision, the captain swore he saw those same lights that had danced on the island cliffs, gliding along the swells, keeping pace with the ship. When they reached port weeks later, they were not the same men who had set out. The laughter of taverns and the smell of cooking meat seemed like a dream from another life. The captain never sailed again. He kept the compass, its needle bent by lightning, locked in a drawer, but sometimes he would take it out and just stare, as though expecting it to point somewhere that no map could show, because he knew the truth. The voyage had never really ended. The sea had marked them, and one day she would call them home.